Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Hello friends, welcome to this, my 8th episode. Thank you for joining me, and thank you so much for rating the show on Spotify. I asked if you would bring me to 50 ratings, and I was afraid I was being greedy, but you brought me to 57. It's like that scary feeling of asking people to come to your party and you get scared no one will show up, but they all do, and they bring 7 more cool people with them. It's a really nice feeling, so thank you. Please continue to rate the podcast on Spotify, review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or YouTube, subscribe, and share the podcast with your weird, sexy friends. I love talking to weird, sexy people. Today's podcast is going to be a little different. I've been sticking to one-ish topics per episode so far, but today is a bit of a hodgepodge. I just keep falling down rabbit holes while trying to figure out how to properly do an episode on Amelia Dyer. She was the baby farmer who killed at least 300 babies. I'm procrastinating this by reading other kinds of horrifying stories in the Illustrated Police News from 1871. If you've never seen this publication, it was kind of like the Inquirer, but if the Inquirer contained stories of people getting burned alive and eaten by pigs, or children throwing themselves into waterfalls in double suicides. It was basically a salacious recounting of police reports from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but also random clippings about naughty orgies, seances performed on coffin-shaped tables, or a guy that fell out of a tree and got his face stuck in a wooden plank. It's kind of all over the place, but it's pretty extraordinary. Also hideously racist and sexist at times, as you would imagine any publication or current events written only by white men in 1871 would be. Even though it's wild and inflammatory and often offensive with its subjects, in many ways it had its finger on the pulse of society of the time, for better or for worse. Mostly worse. I mean this mostly in regard to how you can read between the lines to get the full picture, not necessarily taking the article at face value. You can at the very least get a fascinating view of what Victorian society thought of their culture, their neighbors, their senses of justice, sexiness, you name it. It's also interesting to understand what they did and did not find horrifying about their culture. You'll see what I mean a little later. Just so you know, you can find marvelously preserved entire volumes of this publication online. You can even search by keywords. That's how I found out so quickly just how often people were almost buried alive for my Octavia Hatcher episode. It took me less than 5 minutes to find articles on that topic. They're all on onlinebooks.library.upenn.edu. The full URL is pretty long, so I'll put that in the show notes. Just make sure you have a lot of time, you've poured yourself something tasty in a big glass, and canceled all of your doctor's appointments because you're not going anywhere for days once you start reading this stuff. Today, I'm going to give you a little taste of just some of the dark and weird articles that I found, and some historical context around some of them. And if this format interests you, let me know, because I had a lot of fun with this. I will work up the nerve to dedicate an entire episode to baby farming of the 1800s, but until then, I'm happy nestling myself in this black little hole filled with fantastic illustrations. The illustrations of some of these stories I'll be talking about today are masterpieces. I'm going to put them up on Instagram. You need to see these. Just a heads up, I want to give a warning. Some of the stories that I'm talking about today are deeply disturbing and related to child abuse, domestic abuse, suicide, murder, grisly deaths. If you're triggered by these topics, please be aware that they will be discussed. This very first article is called A Smoking Seance of St. Louis Ladies. I'll start us off fun, and then we'll take a hard left turn into the abyss with the next article. This one's very short. I'll read it first, and then we'll talk about some context. Quote, It is stated as an absolute fact upon the best of authority that nearly all of the fashionable ladies of St. Louis are addicted to the use of the fragrant Virginia weed. They have their little clubs and coteries at which, in imitation of their lords and masters, they puff their fragrant Havanas and sip their mild toddies. Of course, no masculine element is admitted to these fairy festivals, but we have been so fortunate as to secure a sketch of one. And you can see that sketch on Instagram at My Victorian Nightmare. First, remember what I was saying about the hideous sexism? I mean, he just described a great time. Smoking with your girls, no boys allowed, sipping toddies, summoning the dead. This is from 1871, so it's important to note that the ladies may not actually have been smoking pot when he refers to them smoking Virginia weed. Apparently, in 1883, hashish smoking parlors were opened for business in almost every major American city. According to police estimates, in 1883, there were 500 parlors in New York City alone. This article was written 12 years earlier, when cannabis was just starting to be used in medications, but I don't think it was commonly recreationally used yet, not popularly, certainly not by the kinds of ladies this gentleman is talking about. I didn't find any historical evidence to support that smoking weed was common in any corner of American Victorian society, yet. Again, the only mention of cannabis use at the time is in some medications, but those weren't marketed anywhere near as much as opium or laudanum, for example. It's most likely just cigarettes made with tobacco from Virginia that they were smoking, which, as it's clear by the reporter's tone, was frowned upon by men and considered improper. But some ladies did it for that exact purpose. That line, they have their little clubs and coteries at which, in imitation of their lords and masters, they puff their fragrant Havanas. He's referring to their husbands smoking cigars, and the ladies are just imitating them. Here's what's funny about that. Remember that scene in Titanic when Rose, Kate Winslet's character, lights up a cigarette at the table and she's snapped at by her mother? Smoking for some women wasn't just a challenge to, good girl rules. It was a challenge to gender roles, a sign of independence, which enraged men, like our little reporter here, and women of previous generations. A number of years later, in 1908, New York actually passed a ban on women smoking in public. I also love that last line that he wrote, "Of course, no masculine element is admitted to these fairy festivals." The jealousy in that line. You know he wished he could be invited. So, like I said, you can find a lot of tasty bits of history when you read a little between the lines. Okay, to the horrifying deaths we go. This one is called Mrs. Sarah Tuttle Killed and Her Child Terribly Mangled by a Mad Bull in Rockcastle County, Kentucky. On Sunday, November 12th, an old lady named Sarah Tuttle, who resided in Rockcastle County, Kentucky, while going through a pasture on her way to church in company with a daughter, was attacked by a mad bull, which pierced her left side with a horn and tore her heart open. After this, the animal chased the girl, and just before she reached the fence, the bull struck her with his horns and threw her 35 feet over the fence. Her injuries consist of a broken arm, leg, and dislocated shoulder. Persons living in Mrs. Tuttle's neighborhood knew that she intended to go to church, and missing her from the congregation, they visited her house, and not finding anyone home, and the fires being out, a search was instituted. The bull was found first, and the bloody horns created suspicion. Further search was made, and the suffering girl was heard groaning at a distance. She told the sad news of her mother's fate. Still further search was made, and the dead body of Mrs. Tuttle was found weltering in its gore, a frightful sight to behold. End quote. Okay, this is a very sad part. I mean, it's all very sad, but, quote, the neighbors in the mountains around then formed a squad to kill the enraged brute, and a volley of 7 guns was fired into it at a given signal, which only had the effect of maddening it even more than it had been before. He held his ground for about 5 hours, when a well-directed rifle ball brought him down, and his career was ended. And his career was ended? Poor thing. No context needed there, I'd say. Horrifying death number 2. This article is titled, A Woman's Murdered Corpse Laid Across 2 Barrels at Washington, D.C. On Saturday morning, the 18th, information was logged with the police at Washington to the effect that a man named Thomas Cately, living in the northern suburbs of the city, had beaten his wife so severely that she had died, and that he was suspected of being out to get away from the city. Officers immediately went to the house and placed Cately under arrest. It seems from the information elicited at the coroner's inquest that the woman's nose was broken and cut, an eye blackened, and the scalp badly cut. Also that Cately was in the habit of beating his wife and had whipped her badly the night before she died. The woman was found by the officers on a board laid across 2 barrels, and in the same room with the corpse was a shivering, half-starved child, the daughter of the deceased. Cately acknowledged to having been so drunk when he last beat the unfortunate woman that he could not tell how many times he had struck her. He was committed to jail on a charge of causing the death of his wife by brutal and violent treatment. End quote. It's important to note that wife beating wasn't illegal in all 50 states until 49 years after the writing of this article, although in this year, 1871, wife beating is made illegal in the very first state, that being Alabama. But there isn't a specific punishment laid out just yet. That doesn't come till the following year in Maryland, which makes wife beating a crime punishable by 40 lashes or a year in jail. Okay, next. This one is called Man's Nose Stuck in a Board at Concord, New Hampshire. A singular mishap occurred to Mr. Charles Woodman of Concord, New York on the 8th. He was engaged in trimming an apple tree when the limb on which he was working gave way and let him to the ground. Against a fence nearby was leaning a pine board, and Mr. W.'s nose hit this so violently as to force the bone through the fleshy part of the nose, almost cutting it off and into the board 1/4 of an inch deep, leaving a piece of the bone in the wood. The bleeding was profuse, but the damaged member received proper attention. I do hope he was okay after this. This next one's difficult, and I found the historical context for this event too. I'll read the article first. It's called A Girl and Her Lover Burned to Death and Partly Eaten by Wild Hogs. It reads, among the terrible and painful incidents of the recent devastating fires in the woods of Wisconsin, there are few more tragic than the one which is illustrated upon our last page, that I'm going to put in the Instagram. It continues. A young man and woman who were on their way to the house of a clergyman for the purpose of getting married were overtaken by the flames. The lover seized his mistress in his arms and attempted to escape, but becoming confused and blinded by the smoke and flame, he stumbled and fell into a pool of shallow water. The girl was drowned and the man died from exhaustion and suffering. When they were discovered 3 days after by the young lady's sister, wild hogs were found feeding upon the rapidly decomposing bodies. The world will never know 1/2 of the horrors of this fearful fire. End quote. My God. So the, quote, recent devastating fires in the woods of Wisconsin that are mentioned were the Peshtigo Fire of 1871. This was and continues to be the deadliest forest fire in recorded history, with the number of deaths ranging between 1,500 and 2,500 people. Its epicenter was Peshtigo, Wisconsin. Mass graves that were created after this fire are still being discovered. This fire happened on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire, which got much more press at the time, even though the Wisconsin fire killed 5 times more people. I found a quote from a woman whose great-grandfather died trying to escape the Peshtigo fire, who said, quote, Peshtigo was a backwards lumber town then. Who had ever heard of it? Chicago was the big city. Which one was going to get more attention? Ugh. Okay, follow me to the next fire. This one is called Burning of Dealin and Funk's Piano Factory in New York City. Quote, at an early hour on the morning of the 8th, a fire occurred in a piano factory occupied by the Dealin and Funk at number 479 10th Avenue, New York. A large stove situated at the rear of the 3rd floor was used for drying veneering, and it is supposed that the overheated wood ignited. The The flames were discovered about 5 a.m., and several fire engines were promptly on hand battling with the devouring element. From the inflammable nature of the contents of the building, the fire extended rapidly, and soon the 4 upper floors were enveloped in blaze. The more effectually to play upon it and restrain its destructive power, a number of firemen ascended a shed, and by means of ladders directed streams of water on the walls. Suddenly, and without any premonition of danger, a large portion of the southwest wall extending down to the 4th story gave way with a loud crash, and actually buried in the shower of bricks and shattered timbers the men who were working below. Those who were entombed were speedily recovered from the ruins, covered with blood and bruises, some almost unharmed, while others were in the agonies of death. The conduct of both firemen and police is said to have been courageous in the extreme." End quote. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any information about this specific fire anywhere other than it being written in this publication, but I may know why, and it's pretty awful. There were so many factory fires at this time. This one may have not even stood out. 1871 was an especially harrowing year for fires. Apparently, that year was particularly dry and hot, which contributed to the fast spread of many fires. But the mid to late 1800s in general was a constant blaze. After the Civil War, rapid industrialization contributed to the building of large factories with little to no safety regulations. These were sweatshops, basically. They were packed mostly with migrants, children, and other folks looking for steady-paying jobs. Buildings were getting taller, and populations switched from biofuels to coal and gas. Even though it wasn't a factory fire that started the Chicago fire, the entire city was built of wood. Buildings, sidewalks, even roads were built with wood at that time. So you had a denser population who were all using gas and coal to power their cities made of highly flammable materials. These fires in the 1800s to the early 20th century rapidly changed laws about fire safety and fireproofing. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 was one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history, killing 146 workers. This fire led to laws regulating fire extinguishers, sprinkler systems requiring fire drills, fire escapes, fire inspections, and working fire hoses, among many others. Okay, let's move away from the poor people burning to death to a free love seance with a coffin-shaped table. I just completed a podcast on the dawn of Victorian spiritualism. It's episode 7, and I read a lot of descriptions of what seances were like, but the detail in this article is better than anything I read. This article's title is Spiritualism and Its Progress, and it has subsections called The Coffin-Shaped Table, A Strange Scene in an 8th Avenue Hall, A Spiritual Seance in the Dark, and Free Love and Progression. It's a bit strange because the reporter reports about himself coming upon the seance in like the third person. You'll see. Also, the reporter names the location of the seance as being on the southwest corner of 8th Ave and 16th Street in Manhattan. I checked to see what's there now. It's the Google building. If only they knew how sexy and spooky their headquarters is. The article reads, quote, "At 3:30 on the afternoon of November 19th, a reporter was passing the southeast corner of 8th Avenue and 16th Street, New York, when he heard music in the air. The flood of melody gushed out of a door which opened into a dark entryway leading to a narrow, rickety staircase. The following notice was posted in the entryway: Friendly Spiritual Circles, Sunday afternoons at 3 o'clock in Mohawk Hall. All are invited." Climbing the dismal staircase were scores of people who were responding to the invitation. In the center of the room was a table. The top of this table was made in the shape of a coffin. Over it was thrown a black cloth, giving it a very funeral-like appearance. Sitting around this circle with their hands resting upon this coffin-shaped table were 18 men and women. The ends and sides of the room were occupied with seats filled with people, all of whom seemed to take the deepest interest in the proceedings. The 18 ladies and gentlemen in the circle lovingly clasped each other's hands, forming a magnetic circle. The coffin-like table moved uneasily backward and forward and sideways. it lifted itself from the floor, and this time attention was directed from the antics of the coffin-shaped table to a middle-aged woman who went into a trance and shouted at the top of her voice, "Woo-ta, hee-ho, woo-ta." Jumping to her feet with the quickness of a squirrel, she said the spirit of Cicero was speaking through her. The spirit of Cicero discoursed at length on free love. After the audience had grown somewhat weary, the medium ceased speaking, gazed wildly at the ceiling, grasped convulsively, rubbed her eyes hard with her fingers, and dropped into her chair. The room grew darker and darker until the worshippers and the coffin-shaped table were scarcely visible. The gas was not lighted, for the spirits were of that order which seemed to prefer darkness to light. In the darkness, the reporter could dimly see men and women lovingly clasping each other's hands. In a few instances, strong arms clasped feminine waists. Male and female faces were laid lovingly against each other, and the sound of kissing was distinctly heard. A female voice struck up, and the whole assembly joined in singing. Finally, it was announced that the time had arrived for the séance to close. The people, groping through the darkness, passed down the rickety staircase and made their way into the open air. End quote. A bit about why this got so sexy. Many spiritualists were free love advocates. At this specific time in the 1870s, free love, quote unquote, meant individuals should be able to remain romantic partners as long as they like and not be obligated to marry. So we're not talking 1960s concept of free love, just the concept which, at the time, was fairly radical, that you should be able to have sexual relations with people you didn't necessarily intend to marry. This concept wasn't new, though. Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, was very much a free love believer. She met Percy Shelley in 1812. Percy was married, but he and Mary ran away together in 1814. Her specific belief was that anyone should be allowed to love anyone, even outside legal and societal constraints. His wife probably didn't feel the same way about that. But this concept was pretty wholesale adopted by the spiritualists years later, which I didn't realize was actually a big part of certain kinds of seances. Let's take a moment to marvel at the description of this attempted murder in an article called "A Young Girl in Lincoln, Illinois Deliberately Shoots Her Seducer." It reads, on the 28th, Miss Mary Ann Sevendell, aged about 18 years, while in the law office of Beeson and Blinn in Lincoln, Illinois, shot Henry H. Howell of Prairie Creek. The shot was from behind, the ball entering below the right shoulder and coming out at the left breast. It is feared that the wound will prove fatal. After being shot, Mr. Howell walked a few steps about the room dazed, unbuttoned his vest, saw the blood oozing from the wound, picked the bullet up from the floor, handing it to a gentleman present, remarking that he was killed, and then sank upon the floor. Miss Sevendell had a suit against Mr. Howell for seduction, which had just been compromised, and as Howell was starting to get the agreement acknowledged by a party, the shot was fired without a word being said. End quote. What exactly was this woman suing him for? Was it rape? No. Not necessarily. This is a classification of crime that I had no idea even existed in this country. Basically, if a man promised a woman that he would, for example, marry her and use that promise to get her to make out with him or sleep with him, he could be found guilty of seduction, which was a serious crime. These laws were on the books from 1848 until 1978. Basically, the problem, as the state saw it, was that women were being tricked into giving up their most valuable asset, their chastity, virginity, or virtue. This is going to make you puke. An Iowa court ruled that, quote, the person seduced must have been previously of chaste character, that she has yet preserved that priceless jewel that is the particular badge of the virtuous unmarried female. Throw up. Men who were guilty of seducing chaste ladies could face up to 5 years in prison. A woman in 1915 sued a man in South Dakota for seduction and was awarded $25,000, which is about $650,000 today. I have conflicting feelings about this because the laws only existed because women were seen as property to men and their virginity and untouchedness was part of that property. but they gave the women the right to get damages for being tricked into giving it up. I'll need more time to think about how I really feel about this. These were not good laws, I'll say that, but I'm just fascinated they existed at all, to be honest, right? This next one is very sad, and the conjecture and assumptions within the article just kind of make it even sadder. This is an article about a double suicide between a 16 and 14-year-old girl. The details of their clothing also, for some reason, particularly break my heart. The title is From the Precipice to Eternity, Double Suicide of the Mrs. Ada Brown and Anna Wood at West Pitch, Auburn Shore, Lewiston, Maine. About 11:30 a.m. Friday, Mr. Cyrus Cobb, who lives on Court Street just at the Auburn end of the bridge, looking from the rear windows of his store and house, saw two females, apparently young ladies, sitting on the Auburn shore of the river, on the very verge of West Pitch. Mr. Cobb's daughter also noticed the girls and thought it very strange that they should be sitting so near a very dangerous place. The more noticeable became the fact when she saw them jump up and trip lightly and carelessly down the precipitous, rocky, and slippery bank, where they removed their outer garments. Miss Cobb then said to her father that she believed they were meditating drowning themselves, and so possessed with this idea was she that she resolved to still watch them and see what they were proposing to do. After removing their outer garments, including their hats, as she saw the girls return to the spot where they had been sitting and resume their seats, in a few moments, not far from 1 o'clock, the train from Bangor came thundering down the track, being but 200 or 300 feet from where they sat. Miss Cobb says that while the train was passing that point, she saw the girls rise, each throw her arm around the other's waist, and in this embrace they, with apparently one consent, leaped from the shore into the falls. The fact speedily became known, and crowds gathered in the vicinity of the scene of the terrible tragedy, but nothing could be discovered but the garments, bearing silent and at the same time sad witness of the tragedy. The clothing, which consisted of their hats, a waterproof cloak, a shawl, and a black overskirt with a mass of false hair, was of rather indifferent quality. Pinned to the waterproof was a brooch of some black stone, with a medallion face in white in the center of the stone, the whole set in gold. Pinned to the ribbon of the hat were 2-cent bills. Miss Starbird identified the clothing as belonging to Ada Brown of Buckfield and Anna Wood of Hartford, young girls of 16 and 14 years old. Ada Brown had worked at a mill and had been of late at No. 2 Bates Corporation. Her father, John Brown, is a farmer residing in Buckfield. Miss Wood's father is dead. Her mother is now in Massachusetts. The girls ate their last meal at Mrs. Starbird's on Hampshire Street, Auburn. Mr. and Mrs. S. make the following statements. The girls had come to Mrs. S.'s home at 4:30 Thursday. They seemed wearied and said that they'd been searching all day for work without success. Quote, "I am quite dead broke," said Anna, and she showed the 2-cent bills as much as to say, "That's my all." There are slight proofs of the movements of the girls on Friday morning. Wherever they appear, they seem moody, brooding over their lot, apparently meditating suicide one moment and housework the next. At 9 on Ash Street, they are seen seeking chloroform at the drugstore, then wandering through the streets. Enough appears to indicate that Anna Wood was of desponding, moody temperament, perhaps tinged with hereditary insanity, that she had wonderful influence over her associate Ada. Anna succeeded in bringing Ada to her mind, and both plunged into suicidal death, locked in each other's arms. That's the end of the article. Imagine a 14-year-old saying, "I am quite dead broke," and pinning their last $2 to their hat because that's all they have left in the world. This is just such a devastating story. I tried to find more information about it, but I couldn't. Tragic as it clearly is, young children committing suicide was likely not terribly uncommon. I tried to look up statistics on this, but sadly I couldn't find much from this time in history. In my Horror of Victorian Children's Stories episode, I talk about how it was not uncommon to find children as young as 5 working 14-hour days in cotton mills. Over 50% of the workers in British factories in the 1800s were under the age of 14. God, it's just so sad. A child's life was not a safe, happy one for many in this era. Okay, from devastating double child suicides to slutty orgies. My favorite thing about this story is the reporter's disgust for everyone he's talking about and how awful everything is. And yet he arrived at 9 p.m. and stayed until 4 o'clock in the morning. I doubt that he was required to stay the full 7 hours at this event, but anyway, let's learn a little bit about what a French ball was like in this article called Hideous Orgies at the First Ball de la Grande Duchesse at the Central Park Gardens, New York City. The French ball season opened on Thursday night, November 9th, at Central Park Garden, New York City. French balls, as they are erroneously called, seeing that they are given by an American, upheld by Americans, and that probably not a Frenchman could be found, by careful count, present at a single one of them. They are simply masquerade orgies, which should long ago have been stopped by the police. The balls are frequented exclusively by one class of people, the demi-monde. This, by the way, is just French. It's a French term, a 19th century French term, for the class of women considered to be of doubtful morality and social standing. Back to the article. And the men are generally there in the proportion of 10 to 1 to see what's going on. Rows invariably occur, and broken heads are always present in profusion. In some cases, suicide has resulted from these balls, and in fact, there seems every reason to put a stop to these orgies. Sorry. That is one of the funniest sentences I've ever read in my life. Okay. At as early an hour as 9 on a Thursday evening, the people began arriving at the Central Park Garden. Carriage loads of people were coming up every moment, and the empty vehicles started for more loads. 27th Street was the principal market for which the frequenters were obtained, and as they passed in, it was a sight to see with what scantiness of attire some women consider themselves sufficiently dressed. Men began arriving also by dozens, and by 11 o'clock the large hall was completely full of people. All around in various positions, men and women were mingled together on the benches, and on the floor was a perfect pandemonium of talk and ceaseless medley of costumes in which legs mostly predominated. Ooh. And what a crowd of pretty women, suggesting the wildest dreams of the poet. One could stand up on the balcony and look down upon them as they came in, and watch their lovely faces, mostly daubed with paint, and wonder what so much loveliness could contain so much vice, so much beauty, so much sin. Innocence and purity seems imprinted on many of them, and there seems a scared look about many as if they felt ashamed of being in such a place. But 1 hour later, and all was changed. All of the attempted innocence was gone, and nothing remained but the hideous show of vice. Countenances bleated with wine and lips impure with satiety, all decorum seemed to be forgotten, and nothing but the bestial animal nature survived. What a sentence! Prudence and hypocrisy were cast aside, and the true instincts came forth. Women that would meet on Broadway in the day and would glide away as fair vision of purity were here reveling in drunkenness and obscenity. Here were many persons of good standing, husbands their wives at home, wives their husbands away, fathers their children in bed, and even to young girls. But these people seemed to enjoy the thing with infinite zest, all, no doubt, because some brazen idiots built it around enjoyment. At 2 o'clock, the scene was beginning to assume the appearance of an orgy. The music beat faster, and the feet flew quicker, and the excitement grew more intense. The women kicked their legs higher, and the men laughed the hoarser. What hitherto had seemed semi-respectable became downrightly outrageous. Scenes that should only take place in the privy of a chamber were flauntingly shown forth in the open boxes. But it was the champagne room that the excitement grew to a fever heat. Here the tables erected were crowded round, seats being at a premium. The corks flew fast, and the wine flowed around into the glasses, over the tables, down on the floor. Broken heads followed broken bottles, and angry tempers began to be felt in angry cries. Talking, crying, shouting, shrieking from 1,000 human throats, oaths and obscenity, laughing and weeping, all was so mixed up in one horrible, reeking, unearthly din that the spectator might have fancied himself in some frightful scene of Dante's hell. And in all this, numbers of drunken women, their hair falling about their shoulders in disheveled masses, their eyes bleary and dull, their walk unsteady, their lips thick and oozy, and so foul-mouthed that one could not listen to them without a shudder of disgust. Out of 200 women present, it's safe to say there were not 10 but were beastly drunk through all the gestures and postures of the obscene can-can, while the audience reeled in the luxury of their contortions. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the lights went out, and the few remaining drunken couples were ushered to the sidewalk. That's the end of the article. For all this guy's disgust, it doesn't sound like anyone got laid. At least not around him. He probably wouldn't have been invited to the private parlors in this place anyway. Sounds like a stiff. Okay, finally, for our last article, duck hunters, quote, hoisted near Milwaukee. H. Markham of Milwaukee and a friend were lately hunting ducks with a boat in an adjoining lake, the powder being placed in a can under the seat. In moving to a new point, one of the guns fell, discharging its contents into the powder can, which exploded, blowing the boat to pieces, and lifting the gentlemen into the water without, however, seriously injuring them. Meanwhile, the ducks looked on and smiled. That's the end of the article. I love that last sentence. Really crack reporting. It's just wonderful. I'm going to be posting episodes bi-weekly, I think. I tried putting them out every week, but having just the 1 week doesn't give me enough time to fall helplessly down as many rabbit holes as I want to. So again, be sure to subscribe so you see me pop up in your podcast feeds as they're hot off the presses. Please continue to rate the podcast on Spotify, be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in your nightmares.